Trying to learn image editing techniques when our exposure isn't quite as good as maybe it could be will almost certainly make learning to edit more difficult. That alone is likely to cause some frustration, and any editing you're able to do will take much longer. Understanding how our camera's light meter works is going to help. And a eureka learning experience for me was this following exercise. Take a white card outside into bright light. Fill the entire viewfinder of your camera with the card and take a shot. It doesn't matter if you're using manual or automatic exposure, and you can choose any ISO you wish. Record the exposure your camera gave the card. In my example, my camera selected 1/500th of a second at f5.6, yet when I downloaded the image to my computer, I got something like this. A mid-grey which is clearly underexposed. So what do we have to do with our exposure to get that white card to record as white? We have to manually compensate for the exposure the camera wanted to give. We need to double the exposure twice. We usually call that a two-stop increase. And 125th of a second at f5.6 turned out just about right. Now let's do exactly the same thing with a black card, and the camera here indicated an exposure of 1/30th of a second at f5.6. Yet when we download the image to the computer, this is the result. It's the very same grey that we saw with the white card, but this time it's overexposed, not underexposed as we saw with the white card. So what do we need to do to get the black card to record as black? Well, we have to compensate for the exposure that the camera wanted to give. We need to halve the exposure twice, which we usually refer to as shooting 2 stops less than the camera was prepared to give. The exposure required for the black card was 125th of a second at f5.6. But when we look at the correct exposure for both of these cards side by side, we see it's exactly the same for both. The result that we see here is quite logical because both cards were lit by the same light source, the sun. The reason the cards appear grey without our exposure compensation is that the camera records reflected light, and more light is reflected from a light subject than a darker one. However, when you're learning about exposure, it's not very intuitive, is it, to have to give more exposure to a light subject and less exposure to a dark one. Not until we understand how the camera's light meter works does this appear to make any sense. Our camera, as sophisticated as it is, doesn't know if we're shooting a black cat in a dark corner or a white cat in the snow. All our cameras are calibrated to deliver a good exposure for an average subject, and here I'm referring to average lighting conditions. To do that, the exposure meter looks at the scene we are composing and averages the light it sees from the entire frame. Imagine taking the colour from the scene, then blurring that subject, and if the subject is close to an average one, we should see this 18% grey. The issue that we face is that rarely is the scene we've framed up on average for exposure. We're not likely to shoot white or black cards very often, but when we change those cards for real but similar scenes, the effects we have seen here are just the same. So if we were to be shooting a snow scene in bright light or a rainforest on an overcast day, we need to know that our camera is very likely to get the exposure wrong. My point here is that it can be difficult to learn image editing skills if we begin the process with an exposure that may even challenge an expert. I don't want to spend hours in front of Photoshop. I want to be out taking photos, and that is a lament I've heard hundreds of times before. If that really is the case for any of my viewers, maybe you prove my point. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.